It all began with a blister, just a small scrape on the 16-year-old son's toe, Calvin Jr., after a game of tennis on the White House court. But this was 1924, an era before antibiotics. Within a week, what began as a trivial wound became sepsis, and it claimed his life. This senseless death shattered the first family at the very height of their power. The mother forced to bear this grief was Grace Coolidge. Ironically, she was the sunshine of America, the one person whose warmth could melt her famously silent husband. A former teacher for the deaf, she listened with her eyes, a skill she would use to interpret the man who never spoke. This is the story of the interpreter for America's most silent president, the one who taught an entire nation how to understand him. A sunshine who had to shine even when her heart went cold, and a mother learning to live on without her son's voice. She was born Grace Anna Goodhue on January 3rd, 1879, in Burlington, Vermont. This was not the opulent high society world of the coastal elites. This was Vermont. It was and is a place defined by a rugged, sturdy independence. It was a state built on principles of thrift, common sense, and a deep, almost religious belief in education and community. Grace was an only child, the daughter of Andrew Issachar Goodhue and Lamira Barnett Goodhue. Her lineage was pure New England, tracing back to the earliest colonial settlers. But the Goodhues were not aristocrats. They were the very picture of the rising late 19th century middle class. Her father, Andrew, was not a banker or a railroad baron. He was a practical man of the industrial age, a mechanical engineer, and later a steamboat inspector for the Lake Champlain Transportation Company. This was a vital, respected job. He was the man who ensured the great vessels steaming across Lake Champlain, the arteries of commerce and travel, were safe. He was a man who worked with his hands and his mind. He was the kind of father who, in their comfortable home on College Street, personally installed the family's first modern conveniences: a bathtub, central heating, electric lights. This was a home of middle-class comfort, but more importantly, it was a home of middle-class progress. Grace grew up not with the expectation of a dynastic marriage, but with the expectation that she would do something. She was bright, she was curious, and she was, from her earliest days, exceptionally social. She was the opposite of the man she would one day meet. Where Calvin Coolidge was born, into a world of rural quiet, raised by a reserved father, Grace was the center of her family's world, doted on by a father who adored her and a mother who cultivated her social graces. She attended Burlington's public high school, a lively and popular student, and graduated in 1897. In the fall of 1898, she did something that was still a genuine rarity for a woman of her time. She enrolled in college. She didn't go to a finishing school or a women's seminary. She enrolled as a full-time student at the University of Vermont. Right in her hometown, UVM had been co-educational since 1871, one of the first in the nation to admit women, and Grace thrived in its progressive environment. In 1902, she graduated with a 4-year bachelor's degree in teaching. This fact alone sets her apart. When she eventually entered the White House, she would be the very first lady to hold a 4-year baccalaureate degree. While at university, she wasn't a wallflower. She was, as always, a builder of communities. She and 2 friends founded the Vermont chapter of the Pi Beta Phi sorority. She acted in college theatricals. She was part of the Glee Club. From her earliest days, Grace was a person who instinctively knew how to draw people together, how to create warmth and fellowship. She was a natural leader, not through force, but through sheer infectious charm. But her path wasn't aimed at society balls or a comfortable marriage. It was aimed at service. During her time at UVM, Grace developed a powerful specific calling. She was drawn to the challenging, emerging field of deaf education. It was a profession that required a unique combination of skills: scientific precision, boundless optimism, and almost superhuman reserves of patience. After graduating, she didn't return to her parents' home to wait for a husband. She sought out the best training she could find. She moved to Northampton, Massachusetts to attend a specialized program at the Clark School for the Deaf. This was not just a local school. It was, and still is, a world-renowned institution. Founded in 1867, the Clark School was a pioneer of a specific, and at the time revolutionary, method of deaf education. They did not teach American Sign Language, ASL. In fact, they forbade it. This was the era of a fierce global pedagogical debate. On one side was manualism, the method favored by figures like Edward Minor Gallaudet, which argued that ASL was the natural true language of the deaf community. On the other side was oralism, the method championed by the Clark School and its most famous proponent, Alexander Graham Bell. Oralism was the painstaking, incredibly difficult process of teaching profoundly deaf children to navigate the hearing world by learning to read lips and to speak vocally. Bell, whose wife and mother were both deaf, argued that this was the only way to integrate the deaf into mainstream society. He believed sign language would isolate them. Today, this oralist-only approach is highly controversial and has been largely replaced by philosophies that embrace ASL. But in 1902, it was seen as the height of progressive scientific education. This is the world Grace Goodhue entered. It was not just a job, it was a vocation. Think for a moment what this work requires. A teacher must spend hours, days, weeks teaching a child to form a single sound, a P or an M, by feeling the vibrations in the teacher's throat or the puff of air on their hand. It demands empathy. It demands optimism. But above all, it demands an entirely different way of communicating. You cannot rely on spoken cues. You cannot use tone of voice. You must learn to observe every tiny facial movement, every flicker of an eye, every subtle shift in posture. You must become a master of the unsaid. Grace Goodhue, the woman who was a cascade of conversation, steeped herself in a world of profound silence. She spent her days in a state of intense, focused observation, teaching children how to find their voice. In doing so, she became an expert in listening with her eyes. She learned to read the heart beneath the silence. It was a skill that would, in a few short years, become the single most important tool for her survival and her husband's success. She was in Northampton, living this quiet life of profound service, boarding at the house of the school's principal, when one day, watering her flowers, she looked across the street and saw the man in his underwear and a derby hat. Calvin Coolidge was, by all accounts, a strange man. He was 31 years old, a young lawyer just beginning his political career, and he was pathologically shy. He was a fellow Vermonter, but from the other side of the state, the rock-ribbed side. He had graduated from Amherst College and was now practicing law and slowly, methodically, climbing the political ladder. He was known for his clipped, frugal speech and his utter lack of small talk. He was the kind of man who, when asked about his work, would simply say, "Minding my own business." When Grace laughed, he was, by his own admission, instantly captivated. He later said, "I was attracted to her fun." He was not, however, a man of smooth action. He was painfully awkward. He sought an introduction which was eventually arranged by a mutual acquaintance. Their courtship was, like the man himself, unconventional. It was a study in opposites. He was awkward. She was fluid. He was silent. She was a cascade of conversation. He was the granite. She was the river that flowed around him. She was the only person who seemed to find his abrasive silence not off-putting, but interesting. She read him as she read her students, with her eyes. She saw the ambition, the intelligence, and the deep hidden integrity beneath the bafflingly quiet exterior. There is a famous story from their early days that perfectly captures their dynamic. He presented her with a bag of socks, all with holes in the heels, and simply said, "Darn these." It was a preposterous demand. This was 1904, not 1804. Grace was a college-educated professional, a skilled teacher. Many women would have thrown the socks in his face, but Grace, with her bottomless well of good humor and her unique ability to translate, understood exactly what was happening. This wasn't a request for domestic servitude, it was a test. It was his profoundly awkward, Coolidge-esque way of asking a deeper question. Will you take me as I am, with all my holes and rough edges? Grace, with her characteristic laugh, simply took them. She mended every pair, and when she brought them back, she presented them to him, neatly darned. She had passed his test, and in doing so, he had passed hers. She had proven she was a partner, not a prima donna. And he had proven he was a man who, in his own strange way, was seeking one. They were married in her parents' home in Burlington, Vermont, on October 4th, 1905. The ceremony was simple, held in the parlor of the College Street house her father had built. She wore an elegant gray dress and a dark velvet hat. He, as always, looked stiff and slightly out of place. After a brief honeymoon in Montreal, the new Mrs. Coolidge returned with her husband to Northampton. She had left her career at the Clark School behind, as was the custom of the day. Her life of service was over, and her life as a political wife was about to begin. She had no idea what was in store. She had just married a small-town lawyer, a man of few words, and it seemed limited prospects, but she had also married a man of singular ambition. And Grace Coolidge, the expert translator, the woman who could read the unsaid, was now, without question, his greatest political asset. Their life was modest as Calvin's political star began to rise, slowly, steadily, from city council to mayor of Northampton to state senator to lieutenant governor to governor of Massachusetts. Their lifestyle barely changed. Grace was the one who managed the household budget with a meticulousness that matched his own famed frugality. They lived in a rented two-family house for most of his climb. While he was in Boston building his political career, Grace remained in Northampton. She was raising their two sons, John, born in 1906, and Calvin Jr., born in 1908. She was, by every account, a joyful and deeply engaged mother. This was no Victorian matron keeping her children at arm's length. Grace was the mom who played baseball with her boys in the backyard. She was their primary caregiver, their teacher, and their playmate. She was, for long stretches, a de facto single mother as her husband's duties kept him in the state capital. She was also quietly his greatest political asset. Calvin Coolidge was not a natural politician. He didn't glad hand. He didn't charm. He gave speeches that were dry, philosophical, and famously brief. It was Grace who did the charming. It was her warmth, her genuine interest in people, her easy, infectious laugh that humanized him. When voters met the cold, silent Mr. Coolidge, they were often baffled, but when they met Mrs. Coolidge, they were enchanted. She balanced the ticket. She made him make sense. In 1920, Calvin Coolidge was famously nominated for vice president at the Republican National Convention, a surprise dark horse addition to the ticket headed by Warren G. Harding. The story goes that he was in a Boston hotel room when he got the news. He turned to Grace, who had traveled to be with him, and said, "You're going to be the wife of the vice president." Grace, ever practical, simply asked him if he'd told his father. This was the moment her life changed forever. She had been a mayor's wife, a governor's wife, but those roles allowed her to stay in her comfortable Northampton home. Now she was moving to Washington, D.C. The quiet New Englander, the teacher of the deaf, was about to step onto the national stage. From 1921 to 1923, Grace Coolidge served as the Second Lady of the United States. The Coolidges, true to form, did not buy a lavish estate. They lived in a suite at the Willard Hotel. But while her husband presided over the Senate, often in silence, Grace exploded onto the Washington social scene. She was an absolute sensation. The Capitol was used to political wives who were either aristocratic, ruthlessly ambitious, or painfully dull. Grace was none of those things. She was, as one journalist put it, sunshine. She was enthusiastic, unpretentious, and utterly real. She joined the ladies of the Senate, organizing luncheons and charity events. She remembered everyone's name. She listened, really listened, with that practiced skill from her teaching days. In a city built on artifice, her authenticity was like a shock to the system. She quickly and effortlessly became the most popular woman in Washington. And then on August 2nd, 1923, the world shifted on its axis. President Warren G. Harding died suddenly in California. Calvin Coolidge was at his family's homestead in Vermont, a place with no electricity or telephone. The news was delivered by a messenger. In the middle of the night, by the dim light of a kerosene lamp, his own father, a notary public, administered the presidential oath of office. Grace Coolidge, the baseball-playing mom from Northampton, the teacher who loved her work, was now the First Lady of the United States. This transition from a private citizen to the most public woman in America was as sudden as it was profound. The role she inherited was not just one of honor, it was one of repair. She was not just a new hostess, she was a symbol of a fresh start, and she arrived at a White House shrouded in the shadows of her predecessor. When Grace Coolidge moved into the White House on August 21st, 1923, she wasn't just moving into a new home. She was stepping into a role that had been abruptly and tragically emptied. More than that, she was stepping into a house shrouded in scandal. The administration of Warren G. Harding, while publicly popular, was privately rotting from the inside. The Teapot Dome scandal was just beginning to break, and whispers of bootlegging poker games and backroom deals had tarnished the reputation of the People's House. The atmosphere was one of a stale, smoky, men's-only club. Into this walked Calvin Coolidge, the Puritan in Babylon, a man who was the living antidote to Harding's lax moralism. But while Calvin brought the disinfectant of integrity, it was Grace who brought the light. It was her job to, quite literally, air out the house and restore its dignity. She was the one who had to transform the White House from a place of clandestine bargains back into a home, and more importantly, a symbol of national grace. She was acutely, almost chillingly aware of this transformation. She was not a political creature, but she was profoundly insightful. In her diary, she wrote a line that captured the psychological weight of her new position. "This is I, but not wholly I. This is the wife of the President of the United States, and she takes precedence over me." Think about that. The I, the individual Grace, the baseball-loving, fun-seeking, joyful mother and teacher, had to be subsumed by the she, the public role. Her personal preferences, her desires, her very identity were now secondary to the demands of her position. It was a sacrifice she was willing to make, but one she recognized with piercing clarity. Her first act was to take charge of the White House as its hostess, and she was, by all accounts, one of the most popular and effective hostesses in its history. She hosted thousands upon thousands of guests at the obligatory receptions, state dinners, and public luncheons. But she did it with a style that was uniquely her own. It was formal and correct as the office demanded. She restored a sense of decorum that had been missing, but it was not stuffy. It was, like her, infused with a genuine, palpable warmth. This warmth was not just a social grace. It was a political necessity. Her husband, Silent Cal, was not a myth. He was truly, painfully quiet. He viewed social functions as a necessary but deeply unpleasant part of the job. He would host dinner parties and not say a single word to the person sitting next to him. He was known to time his dinners with a stopwatch, eager for them to end. The social and diplomatic wreckage this created was immense, and it was Grace's job to clean it up. She became, as she has been so aptly named, the social interpreter for a silent president. This is where her training from the Clark School for the Deaf became her superpower. She had spent years listening with her eyes, reading the most subtle cues, and understanding the unspoken needs of others. Now she deployed those same skills in the state rooms of the White House. She would glide through the receptions, a brilliant smile on her face, her eyes scanning the crowd. She could spot an uncomfortable senator, a baffled ambassador, or an overlooked guest from a mile away. She would make eye contact, she would smile, she would move in, and with a few effortless words, draw them out. She could make a guest who had just been utterly snubbed by the president's silence feel like the most important person in the room. The stories of their dynamic are legendary. A woman at a dinner party making a bet with a friend gushed to the president, "Oh, Mr. Coolidge, I have a bet with a friend that I can get you to say more than 2 words tonight." Coolidge turned to her, his face a mask, and delivered the famous crushing reply, "You lose." It was a moment of profound, icy rudeness, and it was Grace who would have moments later floated by, laughing, putting a hand on the woman's arm, and with a shared look of, "Oh, you know him," smoothed the entire awkward encounter into a charming anecdote. She didn't just excuse his silence, she reframed it. She was the official translator. When he would greet a long line of guests with nothing but a stiff nod, Grace would follow behind him, beaming, shaking hands, and providing enough warmth for the both of them. She, in essence, told the American people, "Don't worry, he's not cold, he's just Calvin." While her husband was the symbol of an older, quieter 19th century America, Grace became unexpectedly a thoroughly modern celebrity. This was the Roaring Twenties. It was the age of flappers, jazz, and the explosion of mass media. Newsreels, illustrated magazines, and daily newspapers were creating a new kind of national culture, and Grace, with her stylish clothes, her elegant bob, and her ever-present smile, became a fashion icon. She was photographed constantly. She was the first lady to be on the cover of magazines like Vogue, and Good Housekeeping newspapers breathlessly detailed her outfits, from her elegant evening gowns to her famous First Lady red day dresses. She was in many ways the nation's first truly modern First Lady celebrity, a direct precursor to Jackie Kennedy. This created a fascinating public image. Her husband was the symbol of thrift, famously seen counting the pickles in the White House kitchen. He was a man who, when asked if the government could cut taxes, famously replied, "I am for it." He represented the old-fashioned, frugal values of his Vermont upbringing. Grace, on the other hand, represented the aspirational side of the Coolidge prosperity. She was elegance, she was style, she was modernity. Amazingly, these two images didn't clash. They complemented each other. Together, they were the perfect embodiment of the era's strange duality, a booming economy built on a foundation of old-fashioned values. Her husband, however, was wary of this new celebrity. Calvin was, by modern standards, deeply controlling. He forbade her from giving interviews, believing it was unseemly for a first lady to have her own opinions in the press. He disliked her being photographed too often, and he even had a say in her wardrobe. But this, in a strange way, only enhanced her mystique. Her public silence made her a blank canvas for the nation's admiration. She didn't need to give interviews. Her image, her grace, her public warmth did all the talking. The press adored her, nicknaming her Sunshine Grace. She humanized the man they called a Puritan in Babylon. This public adoration was cemented by two of her most famous and most authentic passions, baseball and animals. Her love for baseball was not a political pretense, it was real. Grace Coolidge loved baseball. She was a die-hard fan of the Boston Red Sox, and in Washington she adopted the long-suffering Washington Senators as her home team. She attended games constantly, often slipping away from the White House to sit in the stands. This was, again, a brilliant contrast to her husband. When Calvin attended games, usually on opening day, he would sit stiffly, look as if he were at a funeral, and, as one observer noted, leave in the seventh inning no matter what the score. Grace, on the other hand, would arrive with her own scorecard and a pencil. She would keep score. She knew the players, she knew the stats. She would lean forward, cheering with genuine, unbridled passion. The press and the public adored this. It was so normal. It was so wonderfully American. In an age of artifice, her love for the national pastime was refreshingly, beautifully real. The other passion that defined her White House tenure was her love for animals. The Coolidge White House was not just a home, it was a menagerie. They had a flock of dogs, including the two most famous, Rob Roy and Prudence Prim, both white collies. They had cats, Tiger and Blackie, canaries, a goose, and a mockingbird. But the most famous resident, by far, was Rebecca. Rebecca was a raccoon, sent from Mississippi to be part of the White House Thanksgiving dinner. But Grace, an animal lover, took one look at the raccoon and refused. She adopted her. Rebecca became a national celebrity. She had a custom-built treehouse on the White House lawn. She was walked on a leash. She would be brought out, clean and coiffed, for official events, including the White House Easter egg roll. She was famous for her baths in the White House tub and her habit of unscrewing light bulbs. This was pure Grace. It was whimsical, kind, and slightly eccentric. It was a flash of her personality shining through the stiff formality of her role. By the beginning of 1924, Grace Coolidge was at the peak of her popularity. She had successfully navigated the treacherous transition into the White House. She had restored its dignity, charmed the press, and won the hearts of the American people. She was the most popular woman in America, the beloved Sunshine Grace, who provided the light for her silent husband's presidency. The year 1924 should have been their greatest triumph. Calvin Coolidge, the accidental president, was running for a full term in his own right. He was popular. The economy was booming. The country was at peace. The slogan, "Keep Cool with Coolidge," perfectly captured the nation's mood. And then in one catastrophic, ordinary summer moment, the unthinkable happened. The summer of 1924 should have been a season of triumph. The "Keep Cool with Coolidge" slogan was resonating across a prosperous and peaceful nation. The Republican National Convention had just weeks earlier nominated Calvin Coolidge for president in his own right. The family was at the peak of its popularity, the very picture of American success. In late June, the Coolidge boys, John 17 and Calvin Jr. 16, were at home in the White House. Like most teenage boys, they were active and competitive. They were playing tennis on the White House courts, a daily ritual. Calvin Jr., the younger son, was the one who was more like his mother, outgoing, sunny, and full of life. In a simple, thoughtless act, as teenagers often do, he played his match without wearing any socks under his tennis shoes. He developed a small blister on the third toe of his right foot. It was nothing. It was the kind of minor injury a boy gets and forgets. The kind a mother would scold him for before putting on a bandage. He didn't even mention it for a day or two, but this was 1924. The world was in a golden age of jazz and industry, but it was still in the dark ages of medicine. Alexander Fleming's discovery of penicillin was still 4 years away, and its use as a viable antibiotic was more than a decade off. The blister, a tiny insignificant break in the skin, became infected. The bacteria, likely a virulent staphylococcus, entered his bloodstream. Within a couple of days, Calvin Jr. felt sick. He had a fever and chills. He was put to bed. The family doctor was called. When the doctor examined the boy's foot and saw the red streak of infection, he knew. The diagnosis was septicemia, blood poisoning. It was a death sentence. The boy was rushed to Walter Reed Army Medical Center. The best doctors in the country, the most powerful men in medicine, were summoned to the bedside of the president's son, and they could do nothing. Calvin and Grace, the most powerful couple in the United States, were rendered utterly, totally helpless. They began a 7-day vigil, watching in horror as their vibrant, healthy 16-year-old son was consumed by an invisible enemy. The nation held its breath. The Democratic National Convention, then meeting in New York, was overshadowed by the news. Prayers were offered in churches across the country, but the infection raged, unstoppable. On the evening of July 7, 1924, with his parents at his bedside, Calvin Jr. died. The nation was plunged into a state of shock and profound, genuine mourning. This was not a political tragedy, it was a human one. Every parent in America felt a cold shudder of fear. The boy's body was taken by train, first to Washington, and then for burial in the family's beloved Northampton. All along the route, in towns and at railroad crossings, thousands of Americans stood in silence, many of them weeping, to pay their respects to a boy they had never met. For the Coolidges, it was an apocalypse. It shattered their family, and in many ways, it shattered the presidency. Calvin Coolidge, the man of Vermont granite, crumbled. The man who had faced down political opponents and national strikes with icy resolve was broken by a force he could not comprehend. He was consumed by a depression he would never escape. He became convinced that his son's death was a divine punishment, a payment demanded by God for his own sin of presidential vanity. He believed he was being punished for enjoying the office. He later wrote, in one of the most heartbreaking and revealing passages in any presidential autobiography, "When he went, the power and the glory of the presidency went with him." He was not speaking metaphorically. He meant it. The joy, the ambition, the very purpose of his work vanished. He lost his interest in the job. He began sleeping more, up to 10 or 11 hours a day, plus his famous afternoon naps. He became more silent, more remote, more hollowed out than ever. The light of his life had been extinguished, and his own internal light went with it. He would serve out his term, but in truth, the Calvin Coolidge presidency died that day in July. And Grace? Grace was a mother who had lost her child. Her grief was as profound, as bottomless as her husband's. But her response was, and had to be, entirely different. This is the central, brutal crucible of her life. Her husband retreated into his silence, using it as a shield and a tomb. Grace could not. She was the First Lady of the United States. She had a public role. The expectations on her were inhuman. The historical record notes that she did not let it interfere with her duties, and only stopped organizing events for a few weeks. We read that as a sign of almost superhuman strength. But imagine the reality. Imagine the iron will, the sheer agonizing effort it took to put on a gown for state dinner, to force a smile onto her face, to shake hands with a line of strangers, while her heart was not just broken, but gone. She had to grieve in public. She had to be the nation's hostess while navigating the blackest hole of personal loss. And she had to do it while managing the shell of a husband who had retreated into his own dark world, leaving her to manage both her grief and his. She found her only private solace in poetry. She, who was forbidden from giving interviews, was allowed to publish a poem titled The Open Door. It was her heartbreaking, beautiful attempt to process the unprocessable. It reads in part, "You, my son, have shown me God, you who have gone, and I, who with faltering feet may follow on, but slow, oh slow, as I learn to live without you, son." It is the cry of a mother searching for meaning in a meaningless void. She imagines him not as gone, but as having just passed through a door to another room, a way for her to frame a loss that would otherwise be, in truth, unsurvivable. This tragedy is the event that reframes her entire life. After Calvin Jr.'s death, her work as First Lady was no longer just a duty, it was a lifeline. It was perhaps the only way to survive. She poured her energy, the fierce, boundless energy of a grieving mother, into her work. It was a refuge. It was the one place she could channel her focus and find a sense of purpose that had been stolen from her. She would use the platform that had cost her so much, and she would make it matter. In the aftermath of Calvin Jr.'s death, the White House became a different place. The public duties, the receptions, the dinners, the handshaking continued, but a shadow had fallen. Calvin Coolidge, the man of granite, had retreated so far into his grief that he became, as one aide noted, a different man. He was hollowed out, performing his duties by rote, his silence now deeper and more somber. The power and the glory of the presidency had indeed gone, leaving only the crushing weight of the office. This left Grace in an impossible position. She was not just a grieving mother, she was, in effect, the sole emotional and social representative of the administration. She had to manage her own bottomless sorrow while simultaneously managing her husband's profound depression and carrying the entire public-facing burden of the White House. She could have retreated, as her husband did. No one would have blamed her. Instead, she did what she had always done. She went to work. The I, the grieving mother, was in agony, but the she, the First Lady of the United States, had a job to do. Her work was no longer just a duty. It was a lifeline. It was a way to channel her immense pain into something tangible, permanent, and meaningful. If she could no longer protect her son, she could at least protect and serve in other ways. She threw herself into two great causes that would come to define her legacy: the historical preservation of the White House and her lifelong mission for the deaf. Her first focus was the House itself. Grace Coolidge developed a deep, abiding sense of her role as a steward of the White House's history. It was not just a residence, it was a symbol for all the people. She was frustrated by the state of the executive mansion. Since its reconstruction after the fire of 1814, it had been furnished in a piecemeal, haphazard fashion. Administrations came and went, with presidents and their wives often selling off old furniture at auction and bringing in new contemporary pieces. Grace saw this as a historical travesty. She wanted to stop the flow of history out of the house. With her characteristic soft power, she began to advocate for a more permanent collection. In 1925, she worked with Congress to pass a resolution, a landmark piece of legislation that officially authorized the White House to accept donations of antique furniture, fine art, and other historical objects. This was a foundational, revolutionary step. It was the very beginning of the idea that the White House should have a permanent, museum-quality collection, rather than just being the temporary home of the current president. She established the White House Collection, and in doing so, laid the groundwork for the more famous and more extensive historical restorations that would be carried out by her successor Lou Henry Hoover, and most notably by Jacqueline Kennedy decades later. Her work was not just about aesthetics, it was about permanence. In a life that had been shattered by an impermanent, fleeting tragedy, she was building something that would last. This work coincided with a massive top-to-bottom renovation of the White House. By 1927, the building was in serious disrepair. The roof was failing, and engineers warned that the entire third floor was in danger of collapsing. The Coolidges were forced to move out of the White House entirely for several months, living at a DuPont Circle mansion. Grace, who had just lost her son, now had to oversee a home in complete structural chaos. She used the opportunity. When the engineers added a new structurally sound third-floor attic story, Grace claimed a piece of it for herself. She supervised the creation of what became known as the Sky Parlor, a beautiful, light-filled solarium on the third-floor roof. It was her personal sanctuary. She filled it with plants, wicker furniture, and her beloved dogs. It was a room of light, a refuge from the public gaze, a place of peace high above the staterooms and the political machinery. It was perhaps the one room in the house that was truly hers. While she was preserving the house, she was also, with a new and fiery sense of mission, returning to her first passion, the Clark School for the Deaf. This was not a pet project she adopted for political gain. This was her life's work, the vocation she had left to marry a silent lawyer. Now, she would leverage the most powerful platform in the world for the children she had never forgotten. Her goal was ambitious, to raise $2 million for the school's endowment. In the 1920s, this was a truly staggering sum, equivalent to over $35 million today. She did it with a brilliance that showed her mastery of the First Lady's role. She wrote letters. She hosted fundraisers. She used her popularity, her Sunshine Grace persona, to open the wallets of the wealthiest people in America, but her most powerful act of advocacy was a symbolic one. She hosted her friend, Helen Keller, at the White House. This was more than a tea party, it was a national media event. Keller, accompanied by her teacher, Anne Sullivan, was arguably the most famous woman in the world, a living symbol of human potential overcoming impossible odds. Imagine the scene. Grace Coolidge, the woman who had built her life on listening with her eyes, hosting Helen Keller, the woman who saw and heard with her hands. It was a profound symbolic meeting. Grace's advocacy brought national presidential level attention to the needs, and more importantly, the capabilities of the deaf and blind. She used her platform not to speak for them, but to amplify their voices, bringing Helen Keller's message of education and integration to a national audience. Grace's advocacy was a quiet subversion of the First Lady's traditional role. At a time when First Ladies were expected to be hostesses and nothing more, Grace proved that a First Lady could have a public passion, a cause, without being seen as a political threat. Her ability to raise $2 million was a demonstration of soft power that was, in its own way, revolutionary. She was not a political strategist nor a fiery reformer, but her contribution was no less vital. In the wake of an unbearable personal tragedy, she did not crumble. She took her grief, her platform, and her sunshine persona, and she forged them into a new kind of purpose. She translated her pain into a lasting legacy of preservation and a voice for the voiceless. But this public legacy, forged in her own quiet, determined way, has been the subject of an enduring historical debate. Her very success as a popular, non-threatening First Lady raises complex questions about her role, her power, and the true nature of her partnership with the silent president. When we look back at the life of Grace Coolidge, we find no personal scandals, no political intrigues, no secret ambitions. She was, by all accounts, a person of genuine warmth and unimpeachable character. The controversies surrounding her are not matters of fact, but of interpretation. The central debates of her life revolve around her most important relationship, her public image, and the very nature of her power. The first and most significant historical argument concerns the nature of her marriage. Was Grace Coolidge a willing, brilliant partner, or was she the long-suffering victim of a difficult, controlling, and emotionally stunted man? The victim argument is easy to make from a 21st century perspective. Calvin Coolidge was, by any modern standard, deeply controlling. He forbade her from giving interviews, famously stating, "The business of the American people is business." And he believed his wife having opinions in the press was not her business. He disliked her being photographed too often. He even had a say in her wardrobe, once criticizing a fashionable hat she had chosen. He was, especially after their son's death, a depressive and remote figure. His silence, which the public often interpreted as wisdom, could in private be a cold, suffocating absence. It is easy to view Grace, with her vibrant, sunny, and stifled personality, as a classic doormat, a woman whose bright light was dimmed by a difficult and depressive man. But this interpretation, while tempting, robs Grace of her agency. It cheapens her skills. The other side of the argument is that she was not a victim, but a master. She was not a doormat. She was the foundation. Grace Coolidge, the college-educated expert from the Clark School, was perhaps the only woman in America who could have been married to Calvin Coolidge. She understood him in a way no one else did. She had been trained to listen with her eyes, to find the meaning beneath the silence. She didn't just tolerate his silence, she translated it. She knew his infirmities, his profound shyness, his anxieties. And she knew that her role was not to fight him, but to complement him. She wasn't there to change him. She was there to complete the package. She was not a political partner in the mold of an Eleanor Roosevelt whispering policy advice. But she was, without question, his most essential political asset. Without her, he would have been a historical curiosity, an eccentric governor too strange and cold for the national stage. With her, he was Silent Cal, a man whose silence was interpreted as strength, whose thrift was seen as character, and whose very coldness was made palatable because Sunshine Grace was there to provide the warmth. Her social interpretation of him was the political strategy. This leads to the second great paradox of her tenure, the conflict between her image and his. How could this symbol of Coolidge prosperity and roaring 20s fashion, this modern celebrity on the cover of Vogue, coexist with her husband's legendary, almost comical frugality? This was the man who, as president, was seen counting the pickles in the White House kitchen. This was the man who, when given a dozen high-end cigars, would carefully count them to ensure none had been stolen. He was the embodiment of a bygone 19th century Puritanism. Grace, meanwhile, was a fashion icon. She was photographed in elegant cloche hats, strands of pearls, and stylish fur-trimmed coats. She was the first lady of baseball, the whimsical owner of a pet raccoon, the very picture of 1920s modernity. This wasn't a contradiction. It was a perfect partnership. Together, they were the perfect embodiment of the era's strange duality, a booming jazz-age economy built on a foundation of old-fashioned values. Grace was the one who squared that circle. She was a fashion icon, but she was not a spendthrift. She received many clothes as gifts, and she was a master of appearing elegant without being opulent. She represented the aspirational side of the 1920s, while her husband represented the financial prudence that made that aspiration feel safe and earned. He was the anchor, she was the sail, and together they personified the nation's confidence. We are rich, their combined image said, but we are also, at our core, still sensible. Finally, there is the historical debate over her legacy and soft power. Was she in the end just a charming hostess? Was her contribution merely aesthetic? The answer again is a matter of interpretation. At a time when first ladies were expected to be hostesses and nothing more, Grace's advocacy for the deaf was a quiet, powerful subversion. Her ability to raise $2 million for the Clark School was not just a side project. It was a demonstration of power that was, in its own way, revolutionary. She proved that a first lady could have a public passion, a cause, without being seen as a political threat. She wasn't trying to pass laws or join the cabinet. Instead, she was trying to change hearts and open wallets. She was creating the modern template for the First Lady's role, a template that would be adopted and expanded by nearly every one of her successors. She established the First Lady as a national chairwoman for non-political benevolent causes, a role that was both safe and immensely powerful. In the end, all these debates circle back to one central fact. Her role was defined entirely by her husband. She was the translator, the partner, the sunshine. But this raises the most poignant question of all. What happened to Grace when the man she spent her life translating was gone? What happens to the First Lady when she is, at last, just Grace? In 1927, near the end of his first full term, Calvin Coolidge handed a slip of paper to his staff. It contained 10 famously frugal words: "I do not choose to run for president in 1928. With that, the Coolidges were preparing to leave for Calvin. The presidency had become an unbearable burden after his son's death. For Grace, it was the end of a chapter that had defined her, celebrated her, and cost her everything. In 1929, as they prepared to depart the White House, Grace did something she had never been allowed to do before. She spoke directly to the nation. Calvin, in a rare concession, permitted her to give a short farewell radio address. Her voice, which the nation had never heard, was broadcast across the country. It was, as everyone expected, warm, clear, and full of gracious charm. It was the first time the public had heard her, and it was her last act as First Lady. Her final words were simple: "Goodbye, everyone." They returned to their beloved Northampton, but not to the small rented duplex. They moved into a large, comfortable estate called the Beeches. But retirement was not kind to Calvin Coolidge. Stripped of the office that had both defined and destroyed him, he was aimless, restless, and profoundly depressed. He was a man without a purpose, haunted by the past. Grace, as always, did her best to create a life for them. She was his companion, his hostess, and his caregiver. But the man of granite was hollowed out. On the morning of January 5th, 1933, just 4 years after leaving office, Grace came downstairs from mending clothes. She found her husband. He had died suddenly of a coronary thrombosis, a heart attack, in his dressing room. He was only 60. At the age of 53, Grace Coolidge was now a widow. For nearly 30 years, her identity had been a reflection of his. She was the wife of the mayor, the governor, the vice president, and the president. Then she was the wife of the former president. Now she was, for the first time since that day, she laughed at a man in a window. Simply Grace. The second act of Grace Coolidge is perhaps the most fascinating and least told part of her story. In the 24 years she lived after her husband's death, The world finally got to see who Grace was, entirely on her own terms. After a period of profound grief, she began, as one brief noted, to break some of the rules he had set for her. She became, in a word, independent first. She sold the beaches. The grand estate was too large, too isolating, too full of memories. In a powerful act of self-determination, she bought a smaller, more manageable house, which she named Road Forks. This was her home, not his. And then she began to live. She did things Calvin would never have approved of. In 1935, she took her first ever airplane flight, traveling from Chicago to the Black Hills. It was a thrilling modern experience, and she wrote about it with the delight of a schoolgirl. The woman who had been the face of the roar in the Roaring Twenties was finally truly allowed to participate in it. She took a grand tour of Europe, a trip she had always dreamed of. She was no longer just a hostess receiving foreign ambassadors. She was a tourist, a curious traveler, an independent woman seeing the world she had only read about. She did something else her husband had forbidden. She found her public voice. She began to write. She penned articles for national magazines like Good Housekeeping and the American Magazine. She wrote about her time in the White House, her love of baseball, and her pets. And in one touching and insightful piece, she wrote The Real Calvin Coolidge, an article that sought to translate him one last time, to show the world the warm, shy, and witty man she knew, the man hidden beneath the silent granite exterior. She was at last the author of her own story, and the final interpreter of his. She did not, however, abandon her duty. She was, at her core, a woman of service. She returned to her first and truest passion. She re-engaged with the Clark School for the Deaf, not just as a figurehead, but as a leader. She served on its board of trustees and for many years as its president, tirelessly advocating and fundraising, ensuring her life's work would continue long after she was gone. When World War II broke out, she showed her independence in a new way. Her husband had been a man of 1920s. Isolationism. Grace was not. She was a vocal supporter of American involvement, urging the nation to stand against tyranny. She became a local leader in the war effort. She lent her home, Road Forks, to the local Waves, women accepted for volunteer emergency service, to use as their headquarters. She, the former First Lady, was seen in Northampton rolling bandages, leading scrap drives, and hosting soldiers. She was, once again, a citizen serving her country, this time not as a wife, but as a leader in her own right. Grace Anna Goodhue Coolidge died on July 8, 1957, at the age of 78. She was buried in the family plot in Plymouth Notch, Vermont, next to her husband and, heartbreakingly, next to the son she had lost 33 years earlier. Her legacy is one of quiet, transformative power. She was not a political strategist nor a fiery reformer, but her contribution was no less vital. Grace Coolidge defined what it means to be a modern First Lady. She was the first to be a true national celebrity, a fashion icon, a household name beloved for her personality, not just her husband's office. She proved that soft power, charm, warmth, and grace could be a potent political tool, humanizing an administration and connecting the public to the presidency. She was the bridge. She bridged the 19th century formality of her husband's world with the 20th century media machine. She bridged the silent world of the deaf with the hearing world's corridors of power. And most importantly, she bridged the gap between the silent, stone-faced man in the Oval Office and the American people who so desperately wanted to understand him. She was, as the user's brief so beautifully put it, the sunshine reflecting off the marble. She didn't change the marble's nature, but she made it warm. she made it glow. Her life was a study in contrasts, a life of joyful laughter and profound, unspeakable grief, a life of public celebrity and private, iron-willed duty. She was the woman who began her journey by learning to listen with her eyes, a skill that prepared her, in a way nothing else could, to be married to a man of monumental silence. In the end, she was a translator. In the roaring, chaotic, and cynical world of Washington, she translated her husband's silence into strength. For the American people, she translated the stiff formality of the White House into the warmth of a home. For children who could not hear, she translated her platform into millions of dollars, offering them a voice. And after the presidency, after the tragedy, and after the loss of her husband, she finally translated her own identity, long subsumed by duty, into a life of personal, quiet independence. She was the woman who arrived with a laugh and left a legacy. She was not the marble, but she was the light, and without her, all we would have remembered is the cold and the dark.